I'm Dr. Dave Janda. Welcome back to the Insider Insight Show. I am honored to have back with me someone who is a very dear friend and someone who is freedom's very dear friend, and thereby your very dear friend, Bob Destro. For those of you not familiar with Bob, he wears many hats. But the two hats in particular we're going to focus on today is his legal scholar hat and the fact that he was the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor under the Trump administration. Professor Bob Destro, as I mentioned, is the former Assistant Secretary of State under the Trump administration. He is also a law professor at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law and a constitutional scholar and expert. It is my honor to welcome back our friend Bob Destro. Bob, welcome back.
Hey, Dave, thanks for having me.
Okay, Bob, we're going to focus on a couple different aspects of what's happening around the world, and I cannot think of a better person to have with us than you. In particular, Bob, we're going to dissect today the domestic and international geopolitical landscape. So, Bob, I first want you to put on your law professor, constitutional scholar hat. There are a number of cases working its way through the sausage factory, if you want to call it that, of the legal system and the court system as it relates to Trump. So let's take each of these briefly, dissect, if you could, each one of these four or so venues of these cases and where we are and where you think it's going. First, we recently had a decision by the Colorado, and I use this term loosely, Supreme Court. And also this constitutional guru, the Secretary of State of Maine, who decided that they were going to cleanse the ballot, cleanse the ballot as it relates to President Trump in the upcoming primaries and possibly even general election. This is now spread, this ballot cleansing operation, let's call it by the globalist syndicate. They're moving to bar Republicans from ballots nationwide. In fact, there is a movement to disqualify up to 126 Republicans under the same sweeping theory that they were involved in an insurrection event in early 2021. Okay, Bob. So let's first talk about Colorado and Maine and this ballot cleansing operation and your take and where it's going.
Well, since you asked me to put my law professor hat on, I'm going to start with what I tell my own students, which is if all else fails, read the directions. Okay, so that's and the directions start with the 14th Amendment itself.
Right.
Okay. Now, and I advise anybody who's listening, if you really want a good kind of intro to the 14th Amendment, get on congress.gov, and there's an annotated Constitution, and it takes every clause of the Constitution and kind of takes it apart. And I use it all the time. Okay, so the 14th Amendment was passed or was adopted after the Civil War, 1868, and it was designed primarily to reverse the Dred Scott decision. I mean, Section 1 literally kind of takes apart Dred Scott and obliterates it. Most people don't really realize that. It's also the way in which the court has kind of made up a whole lot of stuff and imposed it on the country. Okay, that's Section 1. The one that we're dealing with in these Colorado and Maine cases is Section 3. Okay, but you can't read Section 3
without knowing Section 1.
No, without seeing Section 5.
Oh.
Okay, Section 5 says the Congress shall have the authority to enforce this by appropriate legislation.
Oh, operative word, legislation.
Pardon?
Yes, legislation.
Legislation.
Yeah.
Right? And the same thing is true with respect to Sections 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so there is a legislative framework And why was it that Congress gave itself the power to do that? There's a lot of what we call enforcement clauses in the various parts of the Constitution. And Congress did not trust the courts. I mean, the whole point was to put Roger Taney, who wrote the famous Dred Scott decision, back in his place. And so basically, you have to read every section of the 14th Amendment in light of Section 5. So the first question would be, especially with respect to the Colorado case, where they go on for pages and pages and pages, and you say, but did you read Section 5? Because it speaks to legislation. So the first thing you should be looking for is implementing legislation. And as a matter of fact, Congress did implement that. And there's a case from 1869 that actually refers to that. They said, look, you can't make up the term insurrection. You can't make up the meaning for this, which is exactly what the Colorado Supreme Court did. It relates to legislation. So first, what did Congress say? And Congress actually created the entire legal framework that the Colorado Supreme Court and the Secretary of State of Maine made up. And then they relied on the January 6th committee reports. And you want to think, wait a minute, these things were kangaroo courts. So Trump has not been convicted of anything, nor has anyone else been convicted of insurrection.
Well, and Bob, tell me if I'm wrong, but so Trump was impeached twice, right?
Right.
The second time, the impeachment was based on this event, this calling into question the election results, correct?
Correct. It was basically Jack Smith's case against Trump, but tried in the Senate.
Okay, so it was tried in the Senate, and he was found not guilty. He was not convicted, correct?
He was not convicted.
Okay, so he's already, which actually gets us into the Smith case down the line, but to me, isn't that double jeopardy? Because you were already tried and I understand it's not a federal court. On the other hand, it is a part of the federal government. And where can they say this can be insurrection when in fact he was found not guilty by the Senate during the hearing as it related to this calling into question the election results?
Well, let me step you back 2 steps.
Yeah.
Okay, because it all does fit together.
Okay.
But you have to look at it through the lens of the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
And so the 14th Amendment is the device that the Supreme Court has used to impose, and I use that in a technical legal sense,
right,
to apply the Bill of Rights to the states. Because by its terms, the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the states.
No.
Okay? And so they use Section 1 of the 14th Amendment like a funnel. And then they do kind of what we call selective incorporation to impose like the right to counsel, the right to bear arms, all that stuff, comes to the states courtesy of the 14th Amendment due process clause.
Okay.
Got it. But the term due process itself, which directly applies to the states, Maine and Colorado, requires that you have fair notice of what the offense is, right? And so the question becomes, well, how do you get fair notice? And the answer is read the directions, read the statute. Right? You have to read the statute, and so you have to say, did Congress define what insurrection means? And the answer is, yeah, they did.
Back in 1869.
Or wasn't he?
Yeah.
Okay. And so you don't come up with your own definition, because to do so would be ex post facto, right? After the fact.
Right.
And it would violate the most fundamental due process right, which is to give you notice of what you're expected to comply with. And so, that's one of the reasons why you have a ban on ex post facto laws, is that you can't get notice beforehand and comply if they make it up afterwards. And so the whole idea that these cases are even, yeah, they're cases in a sense, but they're made up by a bunch of activists. And so what I want you to think about across the board here is that what's going on is they're making up rules as they go along, and then say, oh, they apply to you, but not to us. I mean, the same thing is true with the fake electors.
Right.
It is like, yeah, Jamie Raskin and all these other people who are making a bunch of, and look, the Constitution itself uses the term putative elector. I mean, that's what the Electoral Count Act was about. And so you say, well, what does putative mean? It means people who claim the office. Can more than one person claim the office? Of course they can. Does it become a violation of the law to say, I claim the office and you think I'm, blowing smoke? No. It just means you have a difference of opinion on how the election came out. So when you look at the Colorado and Maine cases, they don't even pretend to comply with due process. Now, your question about so you start with the statute.
Right.
Did they violate it? And then Congress itself, in an impeachment case, the House is the prosecution, the Chief Justice presides,
right,
and the Senate's the jury.
Correct.
Okay, so they charged him with exactly what Jack Smith has charged him with.
Right.
And they acquitted him.
Right. He was acquitted.
They didn't find he was not guilty. They just said, I'm sorry, they found the effect of it is not guilty. Right? And in most cases, those kinds of cases would be that's it.
Right.
And you can't try them again.
Correct.
Now, under the Constitution,
yes,
it says if you're found guilty and removed from office, then you can be tried, according to law. But the Supreme Court's never had to deal with the question of, well, what if you found him? What if you didn't convict him? Right.
Right.
And if you didn't convict him, can you retry him? And there's double jeopardy's one, but it doesn't really apply. Okay, but there's something else which we teach law students, which we call the principle. I'm not going to use the Latin term, but the term claim preclusion. In other words, you get one bite at an apple, right? Yeah. And if you litigate and you lose,
it's
done.
Right.
And so you say, well, who was it that lost? And the answer is the United States lost. Okay, and the reason I say the United States lost is you have the three branches of government acting together, and once they resolve this, it's precluded to everybody else. Right? Nobody else can raise it because technically none of us have standing. Right? We don't have a horse in the race.
No.
We don't have a personal interest in this outcome. This is very hard to explain to students. It makes Con Law 101 very difficult. But the whole idea is this was litigated to a conclusion and it's over. And so one of the issues that Trump has raised, that the president has raised in his motions to dismiss, is you litigated this and you lost. And that's completely separate from the immunity questions. And if the Supreme Court really wanted to avoid all this stuff, right, that's all I'd have to say.
So why don't
you litigated and you lost? It's done.
So why don't they?
Well, we haven't gotten there yet.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court's not going to answer a question it doesn't need to.
I understand. So let's look at the Colorado-Maine situation. At least they're now going. At least the Colorado decision, right, has been put in front of the Supreme Court, correct?
Correct.
Well, Bob, based on the analysis of the 14th Amendment, 1 through 5, Why wasn't there a decision rendered within like 14 seconds?
Well, the argument turns on the phrase "officer of the United States,"
Uh-huh.
and the question is, does the 14th Amendment, Section 3, apply to the president? And most people would argue it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
It applies to everybody else. And in fact, in some very interesting filings, the argument has been that it doesn't apply to the president, and that's that. But there's also an amicus brief that was filed by former Secretary of State, former Attorney General Ed Meese, which goes after Jack Smith's authority to even litigate the case.
Because he wasn't, now tell me if I'm wrong, but to be a special prosecutor, a special counsel, don't you have to be appointed by Congress? And that never happened?
No, it's not. It's both more and less convoluted than that. The short answer is, if you are going to wield the power of the United States, okay, because what the Constitution calls officers of the United States. Mm-hmm. There are two kinds of officers. Mm-hmm. One is like a regular officer, mm-hmm. and then they call them inferior officers. Mm-hmm. Okay, an officer is someone who's appointed by the president and nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and appointed by the president.
Which is what you went through as assistant secretary.
What I went through.
Okay.
And so I was an actual officer of the United States. Okay, and under the law, I could have been appointed as one of those special prosecutors because I'm a lawyer, right? Mm-hmm. And I went through the whole confirmation process.
Oh, got it.
Okay. Now, the same thing is true with respect to any U.S. attorney.
Okay.
Because there's a U.S. attorney in every district.
Right.
There's 94 of them. And so any one of them could be given the task by the Attorney General, prosecute this case.
Because they're lawyers and they went through the whole process, the approval process, right, through the Senate and the like. Okay.
And there is law that supports that.
Okay. Very good.
Okay.
So then the question. So then the question is Jack Smith a lawyer? Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Did Jack Smith ever go through the Senate confirmation hearing process, approval process, as an officer of the United States of America?
And was he appointed by the president?
Right.
And the answer is no.
Okay. Well,
he is a lawyer.
Yeah. All right.
Did he go through Senate confirmation? No. And was he appointed by the president? No.
No, he was appointed by Merrick Garland, the Attorney General. Garland. Okay.
And he did so, and that's why I say you want to read the Attorney General Meese amicus mm-hmm. brief, because it goes through this in very, very compelling detail. Mm-hmm. And the Court of Appeals here in D.C. has said to the attorneys, be prepared to argue the validity of his appointment. Because if he's not authorized to wield the power of the United States,
what's he doing?
This is null and void.
So, Bob, why would that take? Why would that take more than? I mean, this cat's been around for months. Why would that take more than? Let's just give him the benefit of the doubt. Why would that take more than a week? Frankly, it should take an hour. Yeah, were you appointed?
Most people didn't notice. I mean, it's you kind of scratch your head when you say, well, how could you not notice that? But what Merrick Garland did is he went and used the former special counsel rules that Janet Reno came up with. Mm-hmm. But the special counsel, special prosecutor statute expired in 1999.
Okay.
And so there's also another problem with Jack Smith, is that if what we're talking about is what they call a principal officer, right? Somebody who was confirmed by the Senate,
Right.
appointed by the president.
Right.
Then there's also this phrase inferior officer.
Right. That doesn't go through all that.
And then he is an inferior officer is somebody who is appointed to an office established by law, right? So there's got to be a congressional statute, that allows the head of the department alone to appoint him. Okay. So, for example, I had deputy assistant secretaries. Right. Those were appointed by Pompeo because the law says
they can be appointed.
They can be appointed by Pompeo, or they could be appointed by the president. That's what Meadows was.
Right.
He was an inferior officer of the United States because he was appointed by the president alone. Okay, and so by definition, they cannot wield the power of the United States itself. And what I didn't realize until I got involved in a lot of this is that, my commission, which is hanging on the wall nearby,
right,
was signed by the president. And so that meant that, if Pompeo couldn't fire me,
it only could be fired by the president.
You could be fired by the president. Now, if he had called up the president and said, Mr. President,
fire him,
I need you to fire Destro, then I would have been gone.
Right.
But if he had been using me like FDR used to,
he could have just
many ends against the middle.
Right.
He could have said,
"You're
forget
done."
it.
Right.
I've got him on a special project.
Right.
I mean, that's the president's prerogative. Does this make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
So anyway, that's why the Colorado and Maine cases are dead on arrival at the Supreme Court.
Okay, so you predict dead on arrival.
Right.
Okay. So let's go. We were talking about the Smith cases, right? So we got one right in D.C. and another one on the documents in Florida.
Correct.
So where's that going?
Well, the D.C. case could blow up because of this appointments problem.
Right.
And if that happens, which would be the easiest way to resolve it, I might add.
Right. Right.
You say, well, who the hell are you? And believe me, that has been noticed. I mean, that Jack Smith, the brief was written by Ed Meese and the other authors of the brief, because they said, look, you don't have any authority to even invoke the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. Like, who are you? And the Solicitor General is the person who represents the United States in the Supreme Court.
Correct.
And he was completely cut out of the picture. So there's some internal politics.
Could they also use this Jack Smith appointment thing on the document case in Florida? Because he's been the one pursuing that, right?
Yes. And the question that if you had done this the regular way, and you had said, I'm going to pick the U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan to be the special prosecutor. That would have been kosher.
It would be fine.
Okay.
Fine.
But he would have been subject to the push and pull within these agencies with the Solicitor General saying, wait a minute, do you have any idea how you're going to screw up the presidential document stuff? You want us to do a post facto look at what the president's allowed to take and what he's not allowed to take? I mean, those are his documents. And the question of the president is the classification authority. And so I had authority to classify documents, but I didn't have authority to declassify them. Right?
Only the president does, correct?
Only the president can do that.
Yeah, only president.
And so that whole declassification authority question of, like you say, well, wait a minute, if he takes it with him, okay, the analogy is a pocket veto, right? I stick them in my pocket, they're declassified. Right. And the Supreme Court's never had to deal with that one either, because if anybody worth his or her salt in the Justice Department would say, are you crazy? Do you have any idea what a can of worms you're opening up?
Mm-hmm.
You know, are you going to go after Obama, you know, or Jimmy Carter, you know, or any of these? I mean, it's like there's even,
all of them.
Well, it's not just that. It's just that even the Presidential Records Act is of dubious constitutionality to the extent that it tries to limit. The whole classification process is designed to help you advise the president. Mm-hmm. It's not to bind the president. It's to help him. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't care who the president is.
So, Bob, we got these two cases as it relates to Smith in Florida and in Washington. The Florida court seems to be more based on sound legal mind, if you will. Yeah. I'll put it that way. This judge down there who's very... Here it is. Boom, boom. What happens if this judge in Florida goes, Smith, come here. Get out of here. Get out of here. You have no jurisdiction. You are out. Okay, before they rule on the DC side, she says this, right? So there's a decision. Smith, you know, you're get out of here. You don't matter. You're done. So what happens then, Bob?
Well, I mean, when I said to you earlier, I don't think anybody noticed.
Yeah.
Obviously, President Trump's counsel didn't notice. I'm involved in some of these cases. I didn't notice, you know, because it's not something you kind of assume that people have this authority.
But now people have noticed.
Right. Now they have noticed. So it would not be a small step for President Trump's counsel to go into Florida and say, by the way, Judge, we need you to throw this case out because he doesn't have the authority.
Why hasn't that happened?
Do it.
Why hasn't that happened?
Because nobody noticed until they filed this brief. That's why. I mean, and it takes a few days to actually write all this stuff and get it filed. But believe me, I would predict that that's going to happen.
Okay. So let's say the Smith cases, both in D.C. and Florida, are tenuous at best as it relates to the globalist nirvana of these cases taking Trump down. Is that a fair statement?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we already discussed the Colorado, Maine goat rodeo cases, hitting the deck there. Okay. So what does that leave us? That leaves us with the New York case, right? And again there, Bob, they've had testimony in court. And when you boil all that down, when I look at it, you had somebody from Deutsche Bank who Trump had these loans with say he paid it all back. Oh, by the way, well, he overinflated. Well, wait, let me tell you how we do it in the banking system. When somebody comes in and says, here's my collateral, no matter who it is, not just Trump, we cut it in half. We say, your collateral's $1 billion. Okay, 500 million. And because we're just trying to protect our own selves, so we're going to do, well, that's what the Deutsche Bank executive said, which is exactly the whole basis, tell me if I'm off, for this Letitia James goat rodeo case.
It's simpler than that.
Okay.
Okay. And this is where it's all about process.
Uh-huh.
And the nearest analogy to that case is the Alex Jones case.
Oh.
There's two Alex Jones cases,
uh-huh.
one in Texas and one in Connecticut.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And what they did is they imposed what we call a sanction on Alex Jones, mm-hmm. or Alex Jones, and they said you didn't cooperate with the subpoena requests and everything else, so therefore we're going to sanction you, and we're going to rule against you on the merits.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so mm-hmm. basically, so now the only question is how much do you owe us?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's exactly what the judge did in New York. He said, I don't remember the reason, but, he said, basically, I've already ruled that he committed fraud.
Right.
Well, then, this is like Alice in Wonderland, first the verdict, then the trial.
Right.
And so this question of, it doesn't matter that Deutsche Bank.
Yeah, right.
Didn't rely on it. It didn't matter that this is, but what's really at issue here is something that ties to the question that you said you wanted to talk about also with respect to international geopolitics.
Yeah.
And that is they're trying to take all his money.
Yes.
They want his money.
Mm-hmm.
And they not only want to bankrupt him with legal fees,
Right.
they want to literally take his money.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guess what, they're trying to do with respect to all that Russian money? They're trying to take it and use it in Ukraine.
Right.
And
300 billion, I believe it is.
Yeah, 300 billion.
Yeah.
And the question is, wait a minute, do I own my property or don't I? And so when you talk about your globalist stuff, what is it that Klaus Schwab always talks about? He says, you will own nothing and you'll be happy.
Right.
My reaction is, why will you own nothing? Because we will have taken it from you.
That's right. It's all about confiscation.
And so the whole idea is the Letitia James case is about confiscation.
Mm-hmm.
The debate over Russia sanctions is about confiscation.
Mm-hmm.
And my reaction is, wait a minute. First, you have to prove somebody guilty before it says, remember, you can't take life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, and so this whole thing is just completely lawless. They make it up as they go along. That's what the Colorado Supreme Court is. They have people do things that they have no authority to do. That's Jack Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And they have people who are utterly compromised, doing, all this stuff. So anyway, so that's the long-winded answer to a short question.
So the judge has already made his decision before any evidence was entered in this New Jersey case or in this New York case. So we know which way that's going, but obviously that's going to go on appeal. And
Correct.
One would think it would get overturned pretty quickly in appeal. Is that a fair statement?
We would certainly hope.
Okay. So let's look at the final. Georgia.
Yes, sir.
Can you give us your take on that?
Well, the Georgia case, there is a keep your hat on this one, in the sense that there is a case that the Supreme Court will decide whether or not to take, which raises what we call personal jurisdiction. In other words, that is an issue. I've only been involved in a few criminal cases in my entire career, but criminal lawyers are a completely different breed of lawyer than civil lawyers are. Mm-hmm. And that's because we just deal with different aspects of reality.
Right.
But to a criminal lawyer, the court has jurisdiction because the grand jury has indicted.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Georgia case, there's no question with respect to President Trump, for example, that he and Raffensperger had that famous phone call. Mm-hmm. But whether or not he had it in his capacity as president or in his capacity as Donald Trump is a question that we need to ask and answer eventually. Mm-hmm. But the question is, when did Trump ever go to Georgia? What did he do in Georgia? Right? And remember, this whole case is a RICO conspiracy.
Right.
And so the case that the Supreme Court will actually be deciding over the next couple of weeks whether or not to take is a question of whether or not a state can reach out beyond its borders and grab somebody on a RICO theory because they allegedly were a co-conspirator with somebody in state. Mm-hmm. So it's a real basic, what we call horizontal federalism question. And so that's what most of the people ensnared in this Georgia case. Some of the people did stuff in Georgia, and there's no question that Georgia has jurisdiction over them. But there are other people who Georgia just clearly doesn't. And you can't use RICO, to obliterate basic due process, limitations on state authority.
Has there ever been a RICO case where the state reached out across state lines and pulled somebody in that is actually held up?
That's what the Supreme Court's going to be looking at.
But is there precedent for that?
Yes, there is, and but the Supreme Court's never looked at it itself.
Got it. So it's been in a lower court. Lower
case
court.
I don't recall the name of the case off the top of my head, but it's on the Supreme Court's calendar for the next couple of weeks here.
So what ultimately do you think happens in Georgia?
It's not clear. I don't think that Georgia has a very good case against any of these people, because what they've done is they have inadvertently opened up the door to, remember, this is a case about narrative.
Right.
So if you question the narrative, then you're guilty. That's a First Amendment problem all by itself.
Right.
But if you actually look at the data, and they're going to fight like crazy to keep the data out, but we have no idea who won Georgia.
Well, and let's add this fuel to the fire. So, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, who has his own issues, but legal team has formally notified Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, of recording and publishing factually false results concerning the 2020 presidential election, to include 17,852 invalid votes recorded from Fulton County alone. 17,852 invalid votes were more than the 4,000 votes more than necessary for Trump to have won the state of Georgia in 2020.
Right. And that's where the under Georgia election law, which I know quite a lot about, you don't have to prove fraud. All you have to prove is that there was a miscount, or that there was some other irregularity or fraud. So fraud is one of the grounds, but all you have to do is show that enough votes have been called into question to call the election in doubt.
So and this is from Kemp's office.
This is from Kemp's office, yes. So under the terms of the Georgia election challenge statute,
yes,
that he's raised the question, about like, how do you know who won?
Right.
And then you start putting the other things into context, like the Fulton County people who were pressured to sign off on the election.
Right.
And that's just Fulton County.
Right.
I mean, so you could be talking about hundreds of thousands of votes. So keep your eye on the expert reports that they're going to try and introduce in these cases.
And there's been these reports from Haldeman, actually right down the street from me, from the University of Michigan, professor of computer science, who actually, and Totenberg, the judge down there, said what this guy presented, Haldeman, about these voting machines and how votes can be flipped and votes can be altered and tabulated the wrong. This is, and she, direct quote, I believe it was, Bob, this is not conspiracy theory. This has in fact been proven.
Well, I would take it one step further. That case by itself is going to be really interesting, and this was a case filed by Democrats. Okay, so and she's pushed the case forward, and it's going to go to trial pretty soon. I think next week. It could be either next week or the week after, and what is really clear based on the experts with whom I have spoken is that all of those claims, it's a misnomer to say that you can hack into the voting machines. Okay? Why? Because they're open. I mean, in other words, it's like going into a big sewage treatment plant, and you're walking along and you see the water sluicing around, and so you just adjust one of the dials, and so a little bit more goes into one channel than the other channel, and nobody knows because the whole infrastructure is open. So not only can the Chinese didn't need to hack in. Why? Because it's open.
It's kind of like the doors of the Capitol, the magnetic doors being opened and people walking through, right? That never broke a window or broke through a door, right?
No, it's not like that.
Well, I don't know.
It's like, to me, it's like walking down the mall.
Oh, okay.
It's
Good
just
point.
open.
It's just open. Yeah.
It's
Just walk
just open.
So you don't even have to go in the Capitol.
And so when you say were things connect, I was talking to an expert just recently, and he was arguing with somebody in his state. He says these machines aren't open to the internet. He says, do you use memory sticks? He goes, yeah, we use memory sticks. He goes, well, then they're open to the internet because you don't know what's on the memory stick. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's why it used to be that the Chinese would give members of Congress and their staff memory sticks.
Yeah.
As a present,
a token of their appreciation.
Right. Yeah. And that's why you're not allowed. I mean, I would have gotten fired. Right. If I had taken any memory stick and stuck it into a State Department computer other than what I got from the department itself. Mm-hmm. That's how you hack. Mm-hmm. But like I'm saying, it's like we know that the machines in Wisconsin were open to the internet. We know that the machines in Georgia were open to the internet. In Michigan, where you live, if somebody has a seizure vote, that vote becomes invalid. So if any of the stuff in Michigan was open, every vote that anybody had the opportunity to see is invalid. Mm-hmm. So the answer is get rid of the machines, go back to paper.
So, Bob, when folks from other countries look at whether it's the Colorado situation, the Maine situation, the Jack Smith situation in D.C. and in Florida, when they look at the Georgia... Here is from the El Salvador president.
Yeah, right.
Quote, the United States... So now we're going to get into the international side of this. This will be the segue. But, quote, the United States has lost its ability to lecture any other country about democracy when looking at these cases being brought on against Trump.
That's correct. He's absolutely right.
He is right.
But I would add to that we have been meddling in other people's elections for a long time.
Oh, absolutely.
And arguably,
right.
That is the, poor Mike Lindell has been beat up for all the things that he said. And I don't know enough about the substance of his claims to be able to comment, but the fact is that these machines are inherently insecure. That's one of the reasons people like them. Mm-hmm. There was a great editorial, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, about how the Democrats ought to remember the way in which they savaged the Secretary of State of Florida during Bush versus Gore. Mm-hmm. And, and I was a commentator on NPR during the whole 2 weeks of Bush versus Gore. And so every night we would be getting this. I said, don't you people understand that by blowing away the Secretary of State, you have completely eliminated the check on what counts as a vote and what doesn't. There's got to be a uniform rule across the state. Mm-hmm. And I got into a big argument with a couple of constitutional law guys from Yale. I said, look, when you saw those people, holding the, ballot up, to, it's like Karnak, said, look, unless we know what a ballot is, unless we know what a vote is, then there's no standard, and that violates equal protection. Mm-hmm. And so what we're finding is that they have completely screwed everything up. And, and that's why it's like I said earlier, if all else fails, read the directions. There's rules that govern this. And that's what the president of El Salvador says. You guys keep talking about the rules-based international order.
Yeah, right.
It says, what about the law?
Yeah. Look in the mirror, Pim.
Don't lecture us anymore.
So, Bob, let's put on your Assistant Secretary State hat, and let's look at talking about screwing something up. Let's talk about the Middle East. Give us your take on where we are, because my concern, Bob, is that the powers that be, if you will, are fomenting escalation of a war in the Middle East as a distraction, if you will, to a point, of the crumbling financial system, so that people say the reason why the financial system is crumbling is because of what's happening over in the Middle East, what's happening with China and Taiwan, what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, what's happening with North Korea, what's happening with Venezuela and Guyana. Okay, Bob, have at me.
Well, the Middle East is a symptom of a problem, of a much bigger problem.
Yeah.
And, so let me take you 2 steps back.
Yeah.
And you're going to see this coming out in the next, probably tomorrow, when President Biden gives his he's going to give a January 6th speech, and it's like, spare me, but he's going to talk about the axis of evil, right?
Okay.
And so now
Yeah.
Russia has been joined to the axis of evil.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now, so there have been people in Washington who have wanted a war with Iran for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Bob, tell me if I'm wrong, but they were in the State Department as well when you were there, correct?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So this isn't something. This isn't something like in the past 3 years. This has been going back decades, right?
It goes back a long time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'll be with you in a minute. And it goes back a long time, and so the question is, why is that a good idea? And as I was telling, we have a neighborhood book group, and I suggested I was the host last night, and the book I asked them to read is a book called The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this majestic history of the East. And you realize, oh my God, we have been fighting with Russia over Ukraine. We have been fighting with Iran. This has gone on for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. And everybody in the group, except me, is pretty much a liberal. And they all said, this is the same damn thing over and over again. Uh-huh. It's like, we had no idea that these fights have been going on for a long time. And who's at the center of them mostly? The UK. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay.
City of London.
So when you actually look at the Middle East today, you have to understand that you're fighting an ongoing battle that started before World War I. Okay, so this is part of the British kind of plan for protecting India that's now coming apart. Okay, so you have to see it in a much bigger scope. You also have to see that, you have Jordan, you have Saudi Arabia, so part of, why is the Middle East even important to us? And the answer is we're a friend of Israel, right? Mm-hmm. But we needed the Saudis to price their oil in dollars rather than gold. Mm-hmm. And so with the rise of the BRICS, and what you really have is kind of what they call a euro dollar system. Mm-hmm. And most of those dollars aren't even in the United States. But if the Saudis say, look, you can buy your oil in any currency you want, and you can trade in any currency you want, then the demand for treasury bills dies because you don't need to buy dollars. And then so is the war in the Middle East a cover for the collapse of the dollar? Maybe. I think that's part of it, but the whole house of cards was shaky to begin with.
Right.
Now but you can't look at the war in the Middle East without also looking at China and Ukraine.
Correct.
Okay, because we've actually had people, parenthetically, whom I consider to be idiots, who said, well, if you hit Iran, then you'll get China. You get a twofer. And, but if you think about it, China is utterly dependent on Middle Eastern oil.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can cut off the oil supply to China, and but what we don't understand is that China is economically a mess right now.
Right.
They're demographically imploding. They've got more houses than they have people who are capable of buying them. So if we take out China, we wind up taking out ourselves at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get the question of what's Ukraine about. Ukraine's about resources.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the food supply. Mm-hmm. I've heard one of my friends who's very involved with them, says, oh, they've got $17 trillion worth of resources. You say, well, what does that have to do with the war? And the answer is the war is about the $17 trillion in resources. So when you look at all the three together, why does China have Belt and Road? China has Belt and Road because it wants to avoid the stranglehold that the U.S. Navy has in those choke points. Mm-hmm. And so if you really want to, there's been these reports that there's that the Omanis and the Israelis have taken an island off the coast of Yemen that controls the approach to the Red Sea.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then you also have to Google Ben Gurion Canal. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because they want to replace the
Suez Canal with the Ben Gurion
that goes through the Negev, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And what you're seeing is this huge squeeze play on Egypt. Mm-hmm. And so there's a chess game going on.
Egypt, which just joined, as of January 1st, the BRICS group.
Right.
No.
And that's why I said it's all about confiscation. Mm-hmm. Because if you control the food and you control the money, then you control everything.
And the way they control all of that is through leverage and operations such as we have been talking about for many, many years, Bob, that being just one of them, being the Epstein operation, of which Epstein was only the front, I believe, that the real brains of that outfit was far higher than him, which was also Ghislaine Maxwell running that show through her, which she didn't fall far from the tree with her daddy Robert, and tied to the intelligence agencies from around the world.
Correct. I mean, it was a honeypot operation. If you got great pictures of people having sex with minors, what more do you need?
Game, set, and match.
Right.
Bob, educate our listeners on how they can follow you on a regular basis.
Well, all my work is up on the website at Catholic U Law School. It's law.edu, and you just look under my faculty page. You'll see all the work. We're about to. A friend of mine and I are going to be starting a little Substack page pretty soon, but it's too early to talk about that. That's about it for the time being.
And that's fantastic, Bob. I'd like to thank you for everything you have done, are doing, and will do. I'd like to thank you for your willingness to discuss all these issues, because most folks in your position would not be willing to do so. And I thank you, Bob, for educating and in the process empowering every person who is now cognizant of the issues and how you dissected them. And it puts folks far ahead of the curve that they will ever hear through what we call the bought-off lamestream fake media.